lecture answers what factors contribute to the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, and we're focusing on the period directly after World War II, and how these former allies actually became bitter enemies from 1945 to about 1989, in an era known as the Cold War. The first place where they really diverged, and that means when they split off, is in Yalta. Yalta was a meeting where the Allies during World War II are actually meeting. And here's a picture of Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin all sitting down for a meeting. And the reason they're sitting is Roosevelt is actually in a wheelchair. And so the other leaders did not want to see him as being stronger than him, so he's always photographed sitting there. So they meet in Yalta and they decide what they're going to do with Germany after the war. They're going to divide it into 4 zones. There's going to be a French zone, a British zone, an American zone, and a Russian or a Soviet zone. And Germany would have to pay the USSR for the loss of life and property. And Stalin said, okay, if I get Germany, I'll allow free elections. But Churchill right here doesn't believe Stalin. Right? So Europe, he knew Eastern Europe would only be allowed to have free elections as long as it was free to favor Russia. So right there you already have a division. They know after the war that the Americans and the British are going to promote democracy and the Soviets are going to promote communism. So they try to create something to kind of help this. This was a failure. It was called a League of Nations. It was a failure during World War II, and it was going to, during the Great War, and it was going to be a success during World War II. So they have the UN meeting, and they create the UN Charter, and it was ratified in October of 45, and everybody would respect the treaties and the agreements, and you would promote progress and freedom for all people, and you agreed to live in peace and unite to maintain security. And force would only be used to serve common interests. And so this was going to do all the things that the League of Nations could not do. But in reality, you have what is known as the Iron Curtain. This is a very important term. The Iron Curtain is the division between communist Eastern Europe and capitalist Western Europe, capitalist and democratic Western Europe. So you have a split right here, right? So you have the U.S. supporting the countries in blue and the Soviet Union supporting the countries in red. The U.S. was incredibly wealthy after World War II, while the USSR was devastated. They lost 25% of their population, or 25% of their population was wounded or killed. And so the Soviets needed protection. So they want to make sure that these border states are friendly to the Soviet Union. Right? By this time, unfortunately, Roosevelt has passed, and now Truman is in charge. So Truman wants to get tough, and so he says in his language, in his rhetoric, unless Russia is faced with an iron fist and strong language, another war is in the making. So Churchill then gives a speech where he calls this split the Iron Curtain, right? Division between Western Europe and Eastern Europe being communist. So Truman promotes this concept called the Truman Doctrine. And in the Truman Doctrine, you were trying to support Turkey and Greece who were facing Soviet pressure. So what he says is that we've got to help any country who is resisting communism. We're going to favor it. And so we give a bunch of money to Turkey and Greece just so they would not become communist. And then we expand this program with what is known as the Marshall Plan. So what we do is we give countries a lot of money. We give them money. We say rebuild after World War II. So if we give them money, then we could rebuild Europe and they'd be more likely to be democratic. We offer it to every country in Europe, but the countries in green with the red, this is how much money they got. You can see Britain got the most, then France. They are the ones, and they end up being democratic. So 17 countries receive $13 billion in aid. Now it comes to a boil here in Berlin. Here is Germany. Here's all of Germany. And the city of Berlin is actually entirely in Soviet-controlled East Germany. And the Soviets did not like democratic governments in the middle of the Soviet occupation zone.
Mohammed Sheikh, please report to the front office. Mohammed Sheikh, to the front office, please.
An announcement during lunch. It happens quite a bit. So they block all road, rail, and river traffic into Western Berlin. 2 million residents are without food and supplies. And the only way you could supply Western Berlin, which was actually controlled by the Americans, was through war. So they begin to airlift supplies again and again and again into Western Berlin. And so the Soviets end the blockade, so you can supply them through rail or car. But over 280,000 flights have been flown into Berlin to deliver supplies. So the concept of the Berlin airlift shows...
Officer Moon, if you're on campus, please call Nancy. Officer Moon, if you're on campus, please call Nancy on the radio.
Another interruption. It happens a lot. So there was 280,000 flights. So we have this division, and we're trying to avoid war because, remember, both sides have nuclear weapons at this point. You don't want the Americans and the Soviets to fight. So you have two sides. You've got NATO, these countries in blue, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that will be on your test, and the Soviet Union forms the Warsaw Pact, these two competing military alliances, red versus blue. And overriding all of this is the nuclear threat. These countries don't want to directly fight each other. And the USSR had actually stolen American plans for the atomic bomb. And so they realize at any moment they could go to war. And this willingness to go to war and a nuclear war is known as brinksmanship or brinkmanship. And that'll be on your test as well. So we've got to find other ways to compete. And one of the most famous ways the Soviet Union and the US compete without actually directly fighting is the space race, where
Mohammed Sheikh, please report to the front office. Mohammed Sheikh to the front office, please.
So the space race. So the US and the Soviet compete over who gets to go to space first. Soviets launched the first satellite in orbit called Sputnik, and the US puts massive amounts into science and math in their education program, and we are actually the first country onto the moon. So the Cold War is that hostility between the US and the Soviet Union after World War II, and that concept is very important for this unit. Thanks.